October 23, 1935. Dutch Schultz bled out on a hospital bed in Newark, rambling about French-Canadian bean soup and circus shows, while police captured every delirious word, hoping for names of accomplices or hidden cash, but getting nothing except the fever dream nonsense of a dying man who'd been shot in the bathroom of the Palace Chop House because he'd broken the most fundamental rule of organized crime by threatening to kill a prosecutor and bringing heat down on everybody's business. And now Charlie Luciano sat in the back room of Roes Restaurant on East 114th Street, surrounded by the men who formed the commission: Beto Henabez, Frank Costello, Joe Bonanno, Tommy Lucchesi, watching smoke from expensive cigars curled toward the ceiling while they waited for confirmation that Schultz had finally stopped breathing so they could divide up his empire like businessmen discussing quarterly earnings rather than mobsters carving up a dead man's. Harlem Genevius said, stubbing out his cigarette and leaning forward with the intensity of a man who'd been waiting years for this conversation. Schultz spent 3 years trying to take it and failed. We got the muscle. We got the connections. We finish what he started. The other bosses nodded. Made sense from their perspective. Schultz had left behind a power vacuum in the most profitable numbers territory in New York City, worth millions of dollars annually in a neighborhood where poor folks bet nickels and dimes on 3-digit combinations, hoping to hit it big, while policy bankers collected thousands daily from runners working every street corner from 110th to 155th. And the conventional wisdom among men who built empires through violence said you never left money on the table, and you never let black operators run their own show when white bosses could run it better and take a bigger cut. And here was an opportunity handed to them on a silver platter because Schultz had already done the dirty work of breaking resistance and terrorizing opposition, so all they had to do was walk in and claim what he'd softened up for them. Luciano took a slow drag from his cigar, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable a negotiation tactic. He'd learned from Arnold Rothstein back when he was still a street punk instead of the most powerful gangster in America, and when he finally spoke his voice carried the quiet certainty of a man who'd already made his decision and was merely explaining it to people who had uncaught up yet. How many men Schultz lose trying to take Harlem? Costello answered without hesitation. Always the numbers man, always tracking bodies and bullets like a corporate accountant tracking overhead costs. 43 dead. Another dozen disappeared. 26. In prison. Schultz spent 3 years on this and still didn't control it clean. And the money he spent on police protection, on judges, on lawyers for the ones who got arrested, on funerals for the ones who got killed, on payoffs to families so they don't flip to prosecutors how much you think that cost him. Nobody answered because they all knew Schultz had hemorrhaged money trying to pacify. Harlem had burned through profits faster than he could generate them because every time he thought he had control, somebody's nephew would get shot. Somebody's numbers runner would disappear, somebody's storefront would explode at 3 a.m, and the whole neighborhood would light up again like a powder keg that refused to stay calm no matter how much violence you poured on it, and that was uneven counting the political cost of having every black newspaper in the city writing editorials about white gangsters brutalizing Harlem residents, while politicians like Adam Clayton Powell Sr. preached sermons about self-determination and economic justice, creating exactly the kind of racial friction that brought attention from federal prosecutors looking for cases that would make headlines. Have you ever watched someone make the same mistake over and over, convinced that the next attempt will finally succeed when everything they've already tried has proven it in work? Most people define insanity as repeating the same action, expecting different results. But they miss the deeper truth. Real intelligence lies not in trying harder, but in recognizing when the fundamental strategy itself is flawed and requires completely different thinking. Subscribe to see how Luciano understood something about power that eluded the other bosses who thought control came from the barrel of a gun instead of from understanding what people need and finding ways to profit from giving it to them. Schultz failed because he tried to conquer Harlem. Luciano continued, his Sicilian accent barely perceptible after years in America, the old country fading from his voice. The same way the old ways of doing business were fading from organized crime as it evolved from street thuggery into corporate racketeering. You don't conquer neighborhoods where everybody knows everybody and strangers stand out, and police got pressure from politicians to look like they re-protecting black folks, even though everybody knows they're retaking money from white gangsters. You make deals with people who already run the place. Genevieve shifted impatiently. the violence in him always close to the surface, always preferring the direct approach of intimidation over the indirect approach of negotiation. You talking about Bumpy Johnson? He's one guy. We put enough pressure on him. He folds or he dies. Simple, is it? Luciano's question hung in the air like gun smoke. Bumpy Johnson survived 3 years of war with the craziest, most violent maniac we had in the organization. Schultz kidnapped his people, murdered his runners, put contracts on his boss, Madame Cui. And Bumpy not only did Uente fold, he hit back so hard that Schultz could Uente operate without looking over his shoulder every minute. You think that's one guy we can pressure? The room fell silent, because when Luciano framed it that way, the situation looked different than it had 5 minutes ago. Bumpy Johnson wasn't just some black gangster running a small numbers operation. He was a tactician who'd held off Dutch Schultz's entire organization for 3 years, had protected Stephanie St. Clair when she was public enemy #1, had organized guerrilla tactics that killed over 24 of Schultz's men, and had earned respect from people in Harlem who'd rather die than cooperate with white mobsters forcing their way into the community. And that kind of loyalty could be bought or intimidated into submission because it was rooted in something deeper than fear. It was rooted in pride and racial solidarity, in the fundamental human instinct to resist outsiders, trying to take what you built. Here's what I see, Luciano said, standing up and walking to the window where he could look out at the city sprawling in every direction. Millions of people making millions of transactions daily in legal and illegal markets that generated billions in wealth. If you were smart enough to organize it, and disciplined enough to avoid wars that disrupted business, we got 5 families running smoothly because we established the commission to prevent exactly the kind of stupid territorial wars that got Joe the boss killed, that got Maranzano killed, that almost destroyed all of us before we figured out how to work together. The whole point of what we built was to stop mobsters from killing each other over territory when there's enough money for everybody, if we smart about dividing it. He turned back to face them, and every man in the room understood they were witnessing something historic, not the division of Schultz's empire, but the establishment of a new principle that would define how organized crime operated for the next half-century. We make a deal with Bumpy. Erun's Harlem controls all the policy operations, manages the numbers runners, handles enforcement, deals with local politicians, pays off the cops who need paying, settles disputes between smaller operators. Everything flows through him. We don't send our people into his territory. We don't compete with his operations. We don't interfere with how he runs his business. And what do we get? Bonato asked. Always the businessman among businessmen, always focused on the bottom line rather than ego or tradition. He pays us tribute, 20% of the gross weekly take. Every week. Like clockwork. He sends an envelope uptown. We don't count it. We don't audit his books. We don't question his numbers. We take what he gives us, and we leave him alone. The genius of this arrangement was immediately obvious to men who'd grown up in a world where power meant direct control, where being boss meant telling everyone below you exactly what to do and punishing them if they disobeyed. But Luciano had recognized something fundamental about human nature that would make him the most successful organized crime boss in American history. People resist outsiders imposing control, but accept insiders maintaining authority. And the key to sustainable profit isn't maximum extraction through violence, but stable collection through cooperation. Because violence disrupts business and cooperation facilitates it. And if your goal is getting rich, instead of proving you're tough, then you optimize for money flowing smoothly instead of demonstrating dominance dramatically. What if the most powerful position is UNT, one where you give orders, but the one where everyone needs your permission to operate, where you control the rules instead of controlling the players, where you profit from the system without having to manage its daily complications? Drop a comment about whether real power comes from direct control or indirect leverage, from commanding an army or taxing a kingdom. You're making him independent? Genovese protested, his face darkening with anger that someone in their organization would operate outside direct commission oversight. That sets a precedent we don't want. Next thing. Every crew in Brooklyn wants the same deal. Luciano shook his head with the patience of a teacher explaining simple arithmetic to slow students. He ain't independent. He's paying us 20% for doing nothing. We don't have to fight the locals. don't have to worry about racial tension bringing federal heat, don't have to manage runners in a neighborhood where we stand out. Bumpy does all that work, takes all that risk, and we collect our cut every week like landlords getting rent. How is that not the best deal we ever made? The mathematics were undeniable once he laid them out plainly. Dutch Schultz had spent approximately $2 million over 3 years trying to conquer Harlem on soldiers' weapons, bribes, legal fees, and legitimate business. Purchases used to launder the policy profits and, at the end of those 3 years, he barely controlled 10% of the numbers operations and was under investigation by prosecutors while the deal Luciano proposed would generate 20% of Harlem's weekly take with zero investment, zero risk, zero violence, and zero attention from law enforcement, which meant in the first year alone the commission would make more profit from Bumpy as tribute than Schultz had made in 3 years of war. And that profit would continue indefinitely as long as the relationship remained stable. And if he stops paying, Costello asked, playing devil's advocate, because that was his role in the organization, always anticipating problems before they materialized so solutions could be prepared in advance. Then we have a problem, and we deal with it. Luciano conceded. But here's what makes this work. It's in his interest to pay us. He's getting legitimacy from the commission, protection from other white gangsters who might try what Schultz tried, and a clear understanding that Harlem is his territory as long as he respects the arrangement. We're not taking from him, we're selling him something valuable. This was the revolutionary insight that separated Luciano from every gangster who came before him. Previous bosses had thought in terms of territories to conquer and opponents to destroy, but Luciano thought in terms of markets to organize and partners to He understood that the key to sustainable criminal enterprise was on maximizing your take from any single operation, but structuring relationships where everyone benefited from cooperation more than they benefit from conflict, because when all parties profit from peace becomes self-sustaining. But when one party feels exploited, resistance becomes inevitable and expensive. The commission voted 4 in favor, 1 opposed. Genovese had wanted war but accepted defeat because that was the rule. Commission decisions required majority vote and minority bosses had to fall in line even when they disagreed, and that subordination of individual ego to collective interest was precisely what made the commission work when previous attempts at organizing crime families had collapsed into violent power struggles. 3 days later, Luciano sent word to Bumpy Johnson through a mutual contacte black numbers runner named Illinois Gordon, who worked the border territory between Italian East Harlem and Black Harlem, and thus had relationships with operators in both communities. And the message was simple: meeting at the back table of Wells' restaurant on 132nd Street, neutral territory where both men could walk in without starting a war. Bumpy arrived exactly on time, which Luciano respected because punctuality signaled professionalism, and serious criminals treated business meetings with the same formality that legitimate executives brought to corporate boardrooms. He was dressed sharp in a tailored suit that cost more than most Harlem residents made in a month. His tie knotted perfectly, his shoes polished to mirror finish, and his face composed in the expression of a man who learned long ago never to show fear or eagerness, because both emotions weakened your negotiating position. They sat, ordered coffee, made small talk about the weather and the Yankees and a recent boxing match at Madison Square. Garden the kind of preliminary conversation that established respect between men who been enemies 24 hours, but might be partners 24 minutes from now if the negotiation went well. "You know why I wanted this meeting?" Luciano finally said when the social pleasantries had run their course and silence became more awkward than directness. "I can guess," Bumpy replied, his voice carrying the measured cadence of someone who thought carefully about this moment and prepared multiple responses depending on what was proposed. "Schultz is dead. His operation is up for grabs. You're wondering whether I'm going to be a problem. Not wondering if you're going to be a problem if we can make money together instead of spending it on funerals." Bumpy, Stu, dead. Luciano's face with the intensity of a poker player reading tells, trying to determine whether this was genuine negotiation or elaborate setup for an assassination disguised as peace talk, because men in their profession had short memories about yesterday, S-wars, and shorter fuses about tomorrow S-lights. "What are you proposing? You run Harlem? Everything. Policy, numbers, protection, enforcement, whatever else you got going. I don't send my people into your territory. I don't compete with your operations. I don't interfere with your business. You operate independent. That's generous, Bumpy said carefully, because offers that sounded too good usually had hidden costs that revealed themselves only after you decommitted to accepting them. What's the catch? 20%. Every week, you send an envelope uptown with 20% of your gross weekly take. Regular, reliable, no excuses. You do that, we leave you alone. You don't do that, we have a problem. Bumpy didn't answer immediately, and Luciano appreciated the discipline because only amateurs rush to accept or reject major propositions without thinking through implications and alternatives. Instead, Bumpy did the mathematics in his head, calculating whether 20% tribute was better or worse than the alternatives of continued war with white gangsters or complete independence without mafia protection. Here is the calculation he was making. Harlem's numbers rackets generated approximately $50,000 weekly in gross revenue during good times, less during bad, but averaging around $45,000 weekly across a year. 20% of $45,000 was $9,000 weekly going to Luciano, which meant Bumpy would keep $36,000 weekly after tribute, and from that amount he'd have to pay runners, enforcers, lawyers, bribes to police and politicians, and operating expenses for serving as numbers, banks leaving him with approximately $20,000 weekly in clear profit that he controlled, completely without Italian interference in how he ran operations or allocated resources. Compare that to the alternative. Fight the commission the way he'd fought Schultz, which would mean constant warfare, costing tens of thousands weekly in security, legal fees, and lost business because customers do UNT place bets when they worried about bullets flying through store windows. And even if he won that war, which was unlikely because the commission had more soldiers than Schultz, more political connections, more experience in prolonged conflictsy, D end up weakened and vulnerable to the next ambitious white gangster who decided to test whether a black operator could really hold territory against Italian muscle. Have you ever faced a choice between fighting for everything and compromising for most of what you want, between principle that might get you killed and pragmatism that keeps you rich and alive? Most people frame negotiation as win-lose, when smart negotiators understand it's about finding terms where both parties win enough to make cooperation worth more than conflict. Leave a like if you'd take the deal or want to see what Bumpy decided. What guarantee do I have that you won't change terms once I accept? Bumpy asked. Because that was the key question, whether this was genuine offer of stable partnership or temporary truce that would be violated as soon as the commission felt strong enough to take everything. Same guarantee I have that you'll pay every week, Luciano answered. Our word, our reputation, the knowledge that if either of us violates the agreement, we lose more than we gain. This was the foundation of all organized crime, not violence, which was merely an enforcement tool, but reputation, which was the currency that made deals possible between men who could unuse courts to resolve disputes or police to punish betrayals. Luciano's reputation was that he honored agreements even with people he didn't like, that he thought in terms of long-term profit instead of short-term advantage, that he understood cooperation beat competition when both parties had something valuable to offer. Bumpy's reputation was that he didn't fold under pressure, that he kept his word even when it cost him, that he commanded genuine loyalty from people in Harlem, who'd follow him into hell if he asked, because he'd proven he cared about the community beyond his own enrichment. And if I stop paying? Bumpy asked, voicing the same question Costello had raised 3 days earlier. Then we have a problem, and I deal with it, Luciano said, using almost identical language to what he'd told the commission. But that ain't going to happen, because you're too smart to kill a deal that makes you rich and keeps you independent. You pay me for protection, you'd have to pay anyway in blood and money if we fought. So really you're buying something valuable: stability, legitimacy, territory, guaranteed by the commission. That's worth 20%. Bumpy knew it was true. During the 3 years of war with Schultz, he'd spent more than 20% of his profits on defense, on soldiers, weapons, safe houses, for people hiding from Schultz's hitmen, bribes to police and politicians pressuring them to crack down on Schultz's operations, funerals for runners who got killed Support payments too. Families of dead men so their widows did unstarve and turn bitter against the organization. 20% to avoid all that chaos while gaining recognition from the most powerful criminal organization in America. Seemed like a bargain, especially since Luciano was offering something Schultz never had: respect, treating him as an equal partner with autonomous authority instead of a subordinate who'd take orders from white bosses. "One condition," Bumpy said finally. "Your people don't operate in Harlem. No freelancing, no side deals, no exceptions. Any Italian wants to do business above 110th Street, they come through me first. I maintain discipline, and you respect my territory." "Agreed," Luciano said immediately, because this condition actually strengthened the arrangement by ensuring Bumpy had clear authority to prevent conflicts between commission members who might otherwise try to bypass the tribute system by setting up their own operations in Harlem. "Anybody violates that, you tell me and I handle it. You got my word." They shook hands. The deal was done. From that moment forward until Bumpy Johnson died of a heart attack 33 years later in 1968, the arrangement held firm. Bumpy sent tribute uptown every week. Like clockwork, Luciano and Latter Vito Genovis honored his territorial autonomy, and Harlem remained the only major neighborhood in New York City where a black crime boss operated independent of direct Italian control, while paying reasonable tribute for that privilege. The mathematics proved Luciano's strategic genius. Over 33 years, assuming an average weekly tribute of $9,000 adjusted for inflation and market growth, the commission collected approximately $15 million from Harlem, with zero violence, zero arrests, zero federal investigations, and zero operational costs, beyond occasionally arbitrating disputes when smaller operators tried to challenge Bumpy's authority. Dutch Schultz had spent $2 million trying to conquer Harlem and failed. Luciano made 7 times that amount by offering partnership instead of demanding submission. But the real profit wasn't measured in dollars, it was measured in precedent established, in principle validated, in strategic thinking that became doctrine for how the commission handled similar situations elsewhere. When other ethnic neighborhoods pushed back against Italian control, the commission often repeated the Harlem model: find the strongest local operator, make a deal that gave them autonomy in exchange for tribute, maintain stability through cooperation instead of creating chaos through conquest. Jews in Brownsville, Irish in Hell's Kitchen, Latinos in Spanish Harlem all followed variations of the template. Luciano established with Bumpy Johnson because it worked better than the alternative of perpetual war. The irony was that Bumpy's reputation in Harlem improved because of the deal rather than being damaged by it. People who'd been skeptical whether a black gangster could stand up to white mobsters saw that he denegotiated terms, giving him more power than Stephanie St. Clair had ever held, more autonomy than any black operator in New York, and they recognized that he won a different kind of victory, not through violence that would have destroyed the community, but through strategic thinking that protected it. He became known as the Godfather of Harlem, not despite his deal with Luciano, but because of it, because he demonstrated that power came from knowing when to fight and when to negotiate. Years later, after both Luciano and Bumpy were dead, historians and criminologists studying organized crime would point to their agreement as an example of rational strategic thinking overcoming racial prejudice and violent instinct. It wasn't that Luciano suddenly became enlightened about racial equality. He remained a product of his time with all the prejudices that implied, but he understood that his personal feelings about black people were irrelevant to the question of whether he could make more money through cooperation with Bumpy than through war with him. And when profit contradicted prejudice, he chose profit every time because that was what separated successful criminals from imprisoned ones. What's the real lesson here about power and control, about when violence serves your interests and when it undermines them, about whether the strongest position is always the one where you dictate terms, or sometimes the one where you recognize someone else's strength and find a way to profit from it instead of trying to destroy it? Think about how many conflicts in history between nations, corporations, families, individuals would have ended differently if both sides had asked whether they wanted to be right or rich, whether they cared more about dominating the other party or profiting from partnership with them. Subscribe for more stories about the strategic decisions that built criminal empires, not through the violence everyone focuses on, but through the negotiations nobody talks about, The backroom deals that prevented wars instead of starting them. The moments when smart gangsters chose wealth over ego and created stability that lasted decades because it benefited everyone involved more than constant conflict would have. The night before Bumpy died in 1968, in Wells' restaurant eating chicken and grits, when his heart gave out, he sent the week-ass tribute uptown, as he had every week for 33 years. The envelope arrived the next morning with a note from Bumpy's lieutenants explaining he'd passed, asking what the commission wanted done about the Harlem operations he'd controlled. Vito Genevis, who'd succeeded Luciano as boss of the family years earlier, sent back simple instructions. Find someone Bumpy trusted, someone the community respected, someone who'd honor the agreement the way Bumpy had, because the arrangement had made everybody rich and there was no reason to mess with a system that worked perfectly. That's the ultimate vindication of Luciano's strategic thinking in 1935, when he refused to go to war with Bumpy, despite pressure from other bosses who wanted to conquer Harlem the way Schultz had tried. He recognized that the most sustainable criminal enterprises were built on maximum extraction through violence, but unstable extraction through cooperation. That 20% of something lasting 30 years beat 100% of something that would collapse within 3 years. That making Bumpy a partner instead of an enemy transformed a potential problem into a permanent profit source. The question every leader faces, criminal or legitimate, isn't whether you're strong enough to take what you want by force, but whether you're smart enough to recognize when cooperation serves your long-term interests better than conflict, when empowering someone else to manage operations independently generates more profit than micromanaging them directly, when your ego telling you to dominate is costing you money that your intelligence says you could make by negotiating. Luciano answered that question in 1935, and the commission collected dividends for 3 decades. That's the difference between being a gangster and being a godfather. Gangsters fight wars. Godfathers make deals.